So, welcome to today's Tech Hour, and the subject is better technical documentation, and it's been prompted by a meeting I went to, organised by Daniele Procida, who I met through the UK Python conferences. I've met him several times there, and he's unusual for a developer for having a primary focus on documentation, and lately he's moved to become one of several directors of engineering at Canonical, and he's got a responsibility there for improving documentation and process around documentation. He's also a fellow of the Software Sustainability Institute, which is about making academic software durable, if you like. And that gives him a small budget for doing things. And he's organizing a workshop on documentation of research software. So I went to the Nice Discovery meeting for that, which is all very interesting. And if we get stuck, I might borrow some ideas from Danielle and look about and start doing some needs discovery. I'm going to introduce myself briefly. I'm retired now, and I used to work at the Open University where I was the Latex officer, and I also worked in IT as well. So I've got experience in various aspects of things, and I'm part of the sort of old school where documentation is printed documentation, but lately I'm seeing online documentation as being much more valuable. And when I'm not doing tech and Python, I'm doing mathematical research. So would somebody else like to introduce themselves?
Yes, I can jump in. I'm Nelson Beebe. I'm at the University of Utah, Department of Mathematics in Salt Lake City, Utah, where it's just marginally about freezing today. I have a long background in scientific computing and in tech, going back to the late 1970s when tech was being developed. So I have been in most of these tech office hours for the last year or so and followed them with great interest.
If nobody speaks, I'll nominate Phil.
Yeah, so I've been using LaTeX for about 30 years, mainly for writing scientific documents.
Philip, I'm going to volunteer some information about yourself, which is that I believe behind you, you have a large number of DEC alphas running VAX.
Those are actually towers for hard disks.
Okay.
They're just spares, but yeah, I mean, I'm on an iPad now, but otherwise I do everything on VMS.
Yeah, and VMS has got a long history of having good documentation, and Leslie Lamport, the author of LaTeX, worked for digital, and documentation was one of his responsibilities, I believe.
And I think many of the post-Lamport LaTeX developers also worked on VMS, at least for a while.
Yes, and my recollection is at least there was a period in the 1980s, early 1990s, where digital equipment actually produced some of its documentation using tech behind the scenes. Yeah, although the markup was done in such a way that most of the corporate authors worked with a different markup system that was translated in the back end to tech and then to typeset documents.
They had an interesting product which would have one input and could produce HTML or printed documentation or their own online documentation format from the same source. And the printed documentation used tech internally.
Yeah. I think we should move on. I want to say that sometimes the greatest secret, the most important thing to know, is that it can be done. So thank you, Philip. And who's next?
Go on, I'll jump in. You just nominate people, Jonathan, much easier. So I used LaTeX years ago. It's our first non-IBM golf ball documentation system at where I worked. So we used that for a good few years till it was then went to Word on Apple Macs after that. I'm sort of interested in producing documentation from the simplest source. So things that you can version easily on Git, for instance. So Markdown is probably my favored starting position nowadays.
That's mine in some respects, except I've kept more roots in the tech community than you have. Phil, you're muted.
I've unmuted myself now. Hi there, I'm Phil Molyneux. I'm was working for Kingston University, teaching mainly computing, but I've retired from there. But I'm still working for the Open University, doing a variety of things. And I guess I've used LaTeX for about 30 years. But my other software that I've been using is a language called Haskell, Haskll. So it's a bit of a contrast. I mean, the programming languages of TeX and the programming language of Haskell are very much a contrast. And but I think both those areas have the same sort of history of being honourable in documentation and what the languages are for. Which increasingly is going to be quite hard to follow in other areas. Okay, back to you, Jonathan.
Okay. So, John, to introduce yourself, William?
I'm a retired programmer. My first experience with documentation coincided with my very first job in programming in 1962, where I was being taught, so to speak, how to learn the IBM 7090. And the manual that that IBM put out was something that I started to read, and after about a paragraph or two, I was stuck. I could not understand what they were talking about. They kept talking about words, and I didn't know what a computer word was at that time. And it seems like that experience just kept repeating my whole career. So I wish that we had documentation like we had in the old days. It's very specific, answered all your questions usually. That is good documentation. You don't get that today.
Thank you.
Could I just toss in a remark here? I too go back to IBM mainframes in the 1960s. And one thing that was different about IBM compared to its competitors is that the documentation until a lawsuit in the 1980s, or perhaps late 70s, was essentially free, and you could simply ask your IBM office to supply you with printed copies of any manual you cared to have, and they had an enormous number of manuals, and they were generally very well done. So IBM has a long history of producing pretty high quality corporate documentation. However, I don't know what they used internally to produce it, and perhaps someone here does.
Who sued who? Why?
Okay, I can say something about IBM documentation, which is that I believe that William Goldfarb, the father of HTML, was very strongly connected with the HTML, with the IBM documentation. And American institutions such as the Department of Defense were big promoters of HTML. So I suspect that the system they had used what's the word, an industrial quality markup language, such as HTML, rather than.
I think Goldfarb's involvement came much later than IBM was producing documentation even back in the 1950s. It was pretty comprehensive.
So
We never found out how it was done.
So you're going back at least as far as the Mythical Man month and the IBM 360.
And before.
Yeah, I remember reading in the Fred Brooks book on the IBM 360 that one of the things he insisted on was that everybody had an up-to-date set of documentation every day. I mean, the changes were reflected by changes in the pages, and this was paper documentation.
Yeah, let me make that the old DEC documentation was in loose leaf binders. So when the new version of the operating system, you would get some pages to swap out.
Yeah. So I think a good way to proceed, particularly given the demographic we have here, is through culture and history. And I'll say a few words about that to say what I mean, which is part of the Unix culture is man pages, and they have a definite format, they have a definite way of doing things. And the idea that you release software without providing a man page will be enough to persuade people not to use it. And I find that on Linux today, there are quite a few programs that don't have a man page. They're not sort of core programs or system programs, but they don't have a man page, and it doesn't bother me for those sorts of programs. But if I was doing something relating to hard disks, formatting hard disks, for example, I'd expect there to be a man page, and I expect it to be complete and reliable. And the way in which the man pages get updated as part of the software being updated goes all the way back to Fred Brooks and keeping the systems up to date. It also goes back to something that Daniele Procida was saying in the talk I was listening to just now, which is that the documentation should be complete but not finished, because the system is always changing. But given the state of the system as it is should be documented. I think that's what he was trying to say. And particularly in our tech community, we have a cultural change now, which is away from print and onto HTML. And the idea that you can send somebody a link that will give them the page that they need. That's a big cultural change in the sense that it didn't exist in the 70s or really in the 80s. So there's been, with tech, quite rightly, if you like, emphasis on PDF documentation, but there's a whole new generation of web developers, and they quite rightly have a focus on the documentation being available as web pages. So I'm suggesting that we talk about the culture and history of things, and I'll stop at that point.
Does anybody know of any attempt to adapt literate programming with LaTeX?
Actually, there was a package that did allow literate programming in LaTeX, but only a tiny number of documents were produced that way, and it's just fallen by the wayside. In the GNU world and in the Unix community, most documentation that's lengthy is produced in TechInfo format, which was intentionally designed to be printable on a normal typewriter and visible in HTML form or in the info system with links back and forth, but with no inclusion of figures or tables or variations in typography and fonts.
I'm going to make a hypothesis here, which is that documentation systems or documentation tool chains form around communities of users. So the Unix community developed man, or within the Unix community, man pages were developed, and then they became widely adopted. And in the free software movement, and I can't be as precise as Nelson can be, tech info sort of related to a community. And within the world of web development, the tool chain around Markdown seemed to be a big standard for documentation. And in Python, Python's interesting because up to Python 2.3 or so, they actually use TeX plus a modified LaTeX to HTML. And then they found that they couldn't get the quality of HTML that they wanted because they wanted to record more information about the Python functions and so forth. So they developed their own markup language called restructured text. And they still produce PDF, but they turned the restructured text into LaTeX, which nobody ever machine generated LaTeX. And from that, they get the PDF. But again, it's a community. So there's my sort of, what's the word, hypothesis, if you like, that documentation tool chains revolve around existing or growing communities. And if we go and apply that idea to what Danielle's doing, there's a growing community of research software engineers. And I've got some peripheral contact with them. So they're by and large, I think, in their 30s, that sort of age. And they're experts in some fields of some academic disciplines, such as physics or chemistry. And they're doing the software that supports research. And that software needs to be documented. And their goal as an organization is to give the role of research software engineer more recognition, the recognition that they believe it deserves. And the Software Sustainability Institute, which comes out of JISC, which has funded as an academic collaboration that funded the first networks in the UK, they're concerned with software being sustainable, because if academic research depends upon software and the software no longer runs, it can't be verified. So in both those cases, we're talking about community. And in Danielle's day job, if you like, with Canonical, there is again a community involved there. And in a certain sense, perhaps one of the strengths of Canonical was the vision and resources that Mark Shuttleworth had to produce a community around a user-focused version of Linux, distribution of Linux. So I'm suggesting that community is an important part of documentation, and community consists of individuals who all have cultural backgrounds, and they all have, what's the word? We all get older, and new people come along and take the jobs that we used to have. So my personal view is that the tech community has big problems, or let's say could do more, to manage its difficulties regarding generational shift. But I'm going to stop now. I've said too much.
I just interject that in some programming language communities, there are documentation conventions. Java, for example, has the Java doc system that especially formatted comments that are recognized and extracted to document software. There's the deoxygen system for general programming language documentation. And the Rust and Go languages have both a documentation system as well as a practice of embedding test data inside programs that can be very easily run with one or two simple top-level commands. So certainly there are people who are aware of the problem of maintaining documentation of software, but since I come from a research community in chemistry and physics and math, I certainly can tell you that what most graduate students produced is completely undocumented and is lost to the next graduate student. And I've always found that a tremendous failing, that we really ought to pay a lot more attention to documenting software, because typically what a student finds, even though he or she is set to work on an existing program from a previous student, often they simply give up because they can't understand what the code was doing and there's no documentation for it. So they start over. And this has been going on for decades. So it isn't a solved problem, and I see no solution in sight, really.
I think that it sounds to me as though maybe documentation falls into two different user camps. There's the documentation that's needed for program maintenance, and that's needed by the creators of a work. And there's the documentation in man pages that's needed by the users of a work. And when Jonathan started referring to communities, he said user communities, but I think that there's a tendency for the people who produce documentation for users to use the tools that they're familiar with to do so. And consequently, the communities are actually communities of tool creators and documentation creators. Those are the communities that seem to determine the form of the documentation. And from the user's perspective, I think it can be quite difficult to have to keep track of the way many different documentation browsing systems work, and documentation creation systems. From a user's perspective, it might be a lot easier if user-focused documentation was made available in a smaller number of forms.
Thank you for that, Anthony. That's very thoughtful.
Yes, and I think there's also another feature that comes in here, and that is I've known lots and lots of programmers over my long career, and many of them have the attitude that their skill is in programming, not in writing, and they don't care to write and don't write. The Bell Labs was unusual in that Doug McElroy and Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie were very particular that the system be documented as it was being developed, the Unix operating system and the tool set. But that hasn't necessarily followed on. And as Jonathan noted, there are large programs. For example, try typing man Firefox or man Chrome on a Unix system, and it'll say no such page. The attitude of the programmers of these systems is that you don't need documentation because it's obvious how to use the software. And that may sometimes be the case, but mostly isn't.
I'm going to own up to a piece of ignorance, which is when I got my first smartphone, I was surprised and a little disappointed that there wasn't any manual about it, any manual at all about how to use, not even an online manual on how to use it. You just had to sort of wander around and discover for yourself how to use it. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm beginning to think it's actually a good thing as long as there's a sufficient emphasis on user experience. And I think there are some things that do need to be carefully documented. Things relating to security and permissions, for example, need to be clear. I'm reminded of something, which is a book called, I think it's called The Complete Plain Words, which is written by a man called Gowers, who is a civil servant, and it was based upon advice to civil servants on how to write for the public. And one of his famous examples was somebody wrote, if your baby doesn't thrive on fresh milk, boil it. But it's very easy to think that you're communicating effectively because you know what it means, but actually it's quite difficult. And documentation is often a question of communication. Some of it is sort of very technical stuff, and there you need precision of language above all. But a lot of it is about getting understanding. And there, for example, you need good examples. And I think with most documentation, too much is as bad as too little. Too little means you can't find what you want. Too much means you can't find what you want. I'll stop at that point.
So just thinking about a couple of the things that people have been talking about. One is software reusability. So I've not done the sort of academic software writing, but as I understand it, that your experience of that was very very common. But working in industry, then doing documentation is part of the process. It's maybe still not somebody's favorite thing to do, but one of the things that we do where I am is that when somebody develops a piece of software or a process, they write process notes on it, so how to use it. And when a new person joins a team, they are given the process notes in order to find out how to run that process or use that piece of software. Of course, if they find there's something they don't know, they can go back and ask the author or the previous user. But then they are tasked with updating the process notes so that it's a sort of self-healing system in some ways. That it's always a new user can use the system.
So what you're saying, Joe, is that the people that join the organization that have to learn the software, they actually test the documentation.
Yep.
They test the documentation because they're locked, so to speak, locked in a room, and they can't leave with the documentation, and they can't leave. I'm exaggerating, but
you are, yes, but yes, I mean, they sit at their terminal with the documentation. Yes, that's right, or their computer with the documentation, and try and run things, and then they, I would say, in normal times, they would turn around to the guy who wrote it and say, "Oh, I don't understand this bit. What do we do here? I didn't explain that properly, did I?" And then just add the appropriate information so that the next person who comes along has a more complete.
As well as updating the information about the process that they're looking at, do they also update any description of what a set of process notes ought to consist of, the form it ought to take?
Not at the time, because that would be so. There would be discussions on what should be in process notes, but the best person to change the format or the form of the process notes is not a new user. It's an experienced user, but it might be somebody who's experienced in using the other processes who's coming to a different process for the first time. So somebody's used to using the system, but not that particular process.
Can I float an idea, which is that perhaps the inexperience of a new user is actually useful in identifying the nature of what they need to know, not necessarily the detail, but the nature of it. I think that one of the problems I find most frequently is that whether it's for tools or web pages or whatever, documentation frequently takes a how to do this form without actually explaining what is the underlying model that you're able to manipulate, and so you're missing what you're working with, although you're told which levers to pull to get it to make changes, and you're missing an understanding that correlates the system model to the purposes that you're trying to achieve.
So yes, we have a variety of users. Some users will not understand the software in terms of the internals of it, just how to use it. But other users will, well, the maintainers perhaps, who may be maintaining a system for the first time, first time they've seen this particular model or bit of software or whatever, who will have to understand what is going on in terms of the internals of it, as well as how to use it. So things are fairly dynamic. A piece of software don't tend to hang around for more than 5 to 10 years. So there is a process of redevelopment and rethinking of how things are done. So there is a need for somebody to understand what's going on internally. And occasionally things will get chucked out, but not very often. Chucked out because they're not understood, but not very often. Mostly it's a bit of an easier situation because usually the guy who did the work before you is still around. Not always, but usually. So you can say, well, what did you mean here? And occasionally you'll get a piece of software and you think, right, this is so awful, I'm not going to ask the previous guy at all, I'm just going to redo it. and some people can actually go through and take a system and change it in easily understood steps to get to a better place, even though the previous version was a bit of a rat's nest and that sort of stuff.
I'm going to throw something in here, which is sometimes the purpose of software is to do a calculation, and compiling a program is doing a calculation, and typesetting is doing a calculation, and factoring a number into primes is doing a calculation. And reproducibility is really important. And knowing what the calculation is sometimes very important. But other times you're using software as a matter of, well, you want to print something, or you want to play a CD. I mean, most CD players have got some sort of software inside them, and you have to know the controls. So there is a wide range of what it is to be a user. And some people just print from some people administer printers and set up the names and set up the permissions and set up the print queues. And some people, or perhaps the same person with a different hat on, prints a document. So I got a new printer, and yesterday or the day before I installed the printer and got it working. And then today I used it to print off a document, and it didn't work because I'd forgotten to adjust the usual print dialog to use the new printer rather than the old printer. So that's me wearing two hats and not correlating the two. So there's a lot of, what do we say? There's many opportunities for overgeneralization and error in this area. I think that over the past few years, perhaps past 20 years, let's say, the importance of documentation has documentation has become a higher status activity than it previously was. And the same applies to software testing. It used to be the top software testing was sort of sitting a terminal and pressing the buttons and making sure that things happen. But it's now regarded as something that's quite careful and rigorous, and that if you want your software to be durable, you better have a pretty good collection of tests. There's one thing I wanted to say, which I think is relevant, is that recently, and I think it's like about 10 years old, an organization called Write the Docs has been set up, and they have annual conferences. They're actually based in Portland, Oregon, which is where the Tech Users Group office is. So Write the Docs is, roughly speaking, an organization of technical writers. I think it was Anthony that said there are all manners of delivery formats and conventions and so forth regarding documentation, and that seems to cause some difficulty. It's like having a different interface depending on what piece of software you're using, whereas you want some sort of standard conventions. I mean, when I open a dictionary, I know how the dictionary is organized without having to know who published it. I'm going to stop. I'm bowing out.
I raised that as a more than a user convenience issue. My fingers know how to operate the less pager, coming again from the old school background, but my fingers have never got the hang of using Emacs's info, partly because the archaic vocabulary that Emacs uses as a result of having got off the blocks as early as it did. But I think the issue that interests me most is in trying to find the essence of what constitutes an application model, so as to be able to describe to a user, this is what it's all about. This is the real world effect we're trying to achieve, or the computing effect we're trying to achieve, and these are the tools at our disposal. Now I'll go and tell you which levers to pull. But it's that first element, and I think it's very important to have a system model. You raised the possibility of not having one being a good thing when you were talking about mobile phones. Essentially, without one, you're exploring, and in a game context, if you're learning a new game, I'm sure that's fine. You've got all the time in the world, and you can shoot yourself in as many feet as the game allows you. Let's extend that to a CD player. You're only playing music, so what the hell? Who needs any kind of documentation? You just prod at things, and the new stripped down, stylish, bare interface until something happens. But that's no use at all if you're trying to play an audio sample as part of a public broadcast. So that would be a case where the creator's assumption that documentation wasn't needed hasn't foreseen all the possible uses. And that's a founding stone of Unix, that you create simple tools, and they're not based around use cases. They're based on, I don't know what to call it, but they're based on a simple model, and the user gets to understand through the documentation what that model is, and can then exploit it in ways that were never foreseen by the person who came up with the idea and wrote the corresponding tool. And so that's one justification for why I think the what I'm calling the application model of what this system is all about, and what are its constituents, why I think that's key before you you get round to the how to use it. I'd love somebody to come up with a structure for expressing application models. It's been the hardest thing.
I have to say that I learned that 7 nines is 63 before I understood why it was true. It's just you learn the number. You learn by sort of by rote. Now, as a child, then, so maybe that doesn't matter. I think you're quite right, Anthony, that certain things are, what's the word? Certain things have to be got right. The cost of failure is very high. In medicine, it's knowing which side of the body you're going to operate on. That has to be got right, and their documentation and protocol and process are all very important. And for a mobile phone, they're different. I think what you say about the application model, I agree with it, but I'm a pure mathematician, and I want to know what's really going on, and I'm not a person who just sort of wants to do the right thing and delete these files. So sometimes a simple recipe is enough. I trust my bread maker to make my bread, even though my bread maker doesn't understand baking at all. But I trust it that if I put in the ingredients correctly, it does the right thing. So I'm being a bit contrary just to say there may be other examples. But I'm not contradicting your examples at all, I hope. I'll stop.
I think that the need to understand the operating model is only true for a small section of if you like, the general public. There's an awful lot of people are very happy to use something, definitely not read a manual, and for it to just work in as many ways as it does work. And they're not interested in understanding, the physics of light in order to be able to take a photo or any of those sorts of things. They just want the picture. And I think a mobile phone is one of those things where it's designed to be a consumer product. It's not designed to be a computing tool. And in as much as you can make it a computing tool, you're using it in a way it wasn't intended.
With the people you talk about, yes, I can see that perspective. Of course, as soon as there's a power cut, their bread is going to turn out wrong, and they won't know what to do about a power cut without having some concept of the stages that the bread maker is going through on their behalf. And this might interest you. My mum, when I gave her the simplest mobile phone I could find, she couldn't use it, and it was very, very plain. And what was stopping her, among other things, was that a menu was displayed. I forget what the menu showed, but it was a white background with a black highlighted panel under a black background under the selected item. So in a menu of 3 things, your highlighted black background would move through the list. Unfortunately, the menus that turned up on her phone as a result of how she used it had only 2 items. So she was confronted with a rectangle containing a black half and a white half, and had no clue as to what this represented. It was not self-explanatory that it was a menu, or indeed how to use a menu. And I think that was quite a good example of how the makers of devices like that think that what they're presenting is something trivial and self-explanatory, which everyone will get, and by not considering the edge cases, they fail to realize that it's not self-explanatory at all in some circumstances.
I had a very similar thing when I first got my smartphone. I was in the office and it rang, and we were in a meeting, so I turned it off, and then it rang again. Somebody was being very persistent, and my boss said to me, "Can you turn that ringtone down?" And I said, "How do I do that? I don't know how to do it." So, and I just handed it to one of the younger guys, and he said, "Oh, you push it here, you press that button." Ah, right, thanks. But yes, it wasn't. I mean, but I think an awful lot of things rely on knowing somebody else who knows how to use it. So if you look at kids operating anything, they will be, "Show me how to do this." You know, in a classroom, it'll be, "Have you figured that out? All right, just show me that." And an awful lot of things happen like that. And I think mobile phones are the same.
And then the issue that comes up is that underlying knowledge that's communicated between kids or between us verbally most of the time. If you have workers in a reactor, they're communicating that same sort of knowledge to the newcomers, and then they're leaving, and none of them are trained in communicating it. And this is why we need to get to the bottom of how do you model something, because passing on the fundamentals by word of mouth through a number of generations is not a good recipe, and that's why it's a key issue for documentation, in my view. I'll stop there as Jonathan's favorite phrase. It's one I should adopt.
I'm going to start. I've got a bit of an interest in civil aircraft flight safety, and the investigation reports are actually fantastic documents. They are really thorough. They always have, somebody who's trained as a pilot, somebody who's trained as an engineer, and I think somebody who understands the weather. I mean, they take that sort of approach. They don't blame, even if somebody's to blame. And they track down what can be done to prevent this thing happening again. What happened and what could be done to prevent it happening again. I remember one incident where a plane was parked at the wrong place, not where it is usually. Right place, but not the usual place. And the maintenance crew went to the wrong plane because the signs at that level weren't clear. And as a result, a plane took off with the engine cowling half open, not properly latched. And whilst the number of people made the errors, one of the things was the signage at that level of the airport was deficient. And there'll always be these things coming up. And here's something can I show this to you? Does this work? Sorry.
Hold it at a slight angle, it won't reflect the window.
Air and air and air again, but less and less and less. That is the road. The road to wisdom is well, it's plain and easy to express. So this is something that Pierre Hein wrote that Don Knuth has taken as a motto for his work, which in summary is have an error log. And this goes back to an earlier comment based upon Joe's work, based on what Joe said, which is when there are documentation errors, fix them, but also figure out where they came from. What is it? Oh yes, there's something called test-driven development, and part of that has the view that if there's a bug in your software, then there's actually two bugs. The first bug is that there's a deficiency in your tests. And the second bug is that if the test that was missing was added, it would fail. And so you never change software except in response to a failing test. And the conclusion I'm sort of coming to is process is really important. And by process, I don't necessarily mean the tool chain. I mean the sort of the human process, the social process, the interactions between people, the protocols that ensure that the tooth that is extracted is the tooth that should be extracted, for example, and that the medicine goes to the patient that should be getting it. And all that is a matter of protocols and procedures. So the TeX system, when it's used for documentation, sort of provides you with support and takes you down particular directions. And I think that's very reassuring and very helpful. But here's an insight I've had during the conversation. The documentation all the way down to the source code and perhaps even down to the hardware is often very vast. It's often very, very large. And it has to be consistent and true. And each user, each reader of the documentation is interested in only a subset of the documentation. So in a sense, that's a bit like the laws of the land. Very few people have a knowledge of all the laws of the land, but they all have to fit together. And when they don't fit together, it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in terms of modern things, I think that puts an emphasis on links between the various parts of the documentation. So citing the source, you know, this piece of software, this documentation describes the behavior of this part of the system. And then the other thing, which is quite mundane, is browser history. Browser history is really important to me. And Google, in a sense, exploit browser history by optimizing their search results. You know, they put up a search page for, oh, I don't know, Linux formatted disk, and they keep a track that they notice which links get clicked. You know, they put the top 10 links, and one of them will get clicked first, and they use that to engineer the system so they can improve the system. I'll stop now. We normally stop at 7:30, I think, and then people can go and they can stay if they want to. But I think we can stay a bit longer, and I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to share some wisdom or questions or anything else before we invite people to leave if they wish to leave. So closing words.
Pick on somebody, Jonathan.
Nelson's volunteered.
Yeah, I was going to just make a comment that the skill of writing is a fairly general one. It's language independent and culture independent. It's a very important one, but it's not one that's terribly emphasized in our education systems worldwide. Don Knuth always made a point that he felt it was extremely important for the author of a piece of software to be the first one to document it. And then it was fine for other people to come along and offer different viewpoints. And Don once told me that he and his wife, when their children were in school, felt that they weren't learning enough about writing. And so they told the two children that it was their job at home to write one essay for their parents a week on any topic of their choosing. And so they went through school getting used to writing considerably more than they would have if they had just done school assignments. One of my colleagues here a few years ago organized a course on technical writing because he felt that students in physics and math weren't doing enough writing. And a major part of the course was having the students write about things that had been discussed in class to get skills in writing. And it's I think, unfortunate that many students in graduate school find that their very first big writing project, in fact, is their dissertation or thesis, and that's kind of late. So I think anything we can do to increase the skill of writing on the part of people in our education systems is beneficial. And it's very, very general. It isn't directed just towards software documentation. Because if you look at people's careers, consider an engineer, a young engineer actually does engineering. He or she goes out in the field and with equipment and does measurements and directs construction and so on. But by that time that person is in their late 30s or 40s, they're now sitting at a desk writing documentation and writing grant proposals and responding to requests for price quotations and so on. And they will typically spend the rest of their career writing. A friend of mine who did a postdoc at one of our national laboratories related the same experience. He said most of the people that were 40 plus spent their time writing. They didn't do science anymore, didn't do math anymore, they did writing. And so that's, I think, an important lesson that writing is a very important skill and it's worth honing one's ability to do it well, because it will benefit you in your career.
I'm going to like to invite Joe to make some comments if you'd like to.
Yeah, so yeah, writing is important. I spend, so I'm still at the keyboard interface, whatever, most of writing software or running software or analyzing stuff. So I spend most of the time in Python or SAS or Excel, but I'm probably now spending a quarter of my time writing words, you know, explaining what's going on and all the rest of it. So yeah, I think writing is important.
Phil, would you like to say something about the documentation of Haskell?
Well, Haskell.
You can mention Haddock if you want to.
Well, I could do, but I mainly use the Literate Haskell, which is I embed my LaTeX in Haskell, so my source code is simultaneously a target for Haskell and a target for LaTeX. And the discipline of writing your code and documentation simultaneously together, I think is a good discipline, because it also tries to make you write your code so it could be read by somebody who's reading the documentation. It may well be that there's some bits that are unique or use some thing that's special, but usually if you can't read the code, it probably means you haven't written it very well. So it goes together. I mean, it's and I think quite a lot of people in the Haskell world do that. They write a document, and the one document is both the documentation and the code, which so they're not separate. I mean, the code that you see is the code that got run. Errors as well. And I think that's quite important. And the same goes, I mean, for producing presentation material, because you can have simultaneously the material being a target for Haskell, a target for being printed as an A4 or a letter page document, or also being printed as slides, Beamer slides. So you're always very conscious that you've got multiple targets and that somehow the whole thing must work for all of the targets. And if it doesn't, then you've got to really justify why one bit should be special. Because usually it doesn't need to be special. It usually making stuff accessible or reasonably literate is important anyway. That's it from me. Yeah. Yeah.
You're reminding me of one of the laws of data normalization, which is that any piece of databases, which is any piece of data in the system should be stored in only one place.
Oh, well, no, Haskell's worse. Haskell's worse than that. Haskell is worse than that. Its golden rule is that any expression should be evaluated at most once, and if possible, not at all, because that would save time.
Yeah, the reason I said that is that the system is always changing, or it changes if we don't know about it. And if the documentation isn't in sync.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So the tool chain is important because of certain values. There are certain values associated with documentation, one of which is truth and consistency.
Yeah. In recent times, some of the Open University courses have adopted Jupyter Notebooks or Jupyter Lab as their medium for providing both text, diagrams, and in most cases Python. And I think that influences their writing style quite considerably. I think for some of them it's a bit tricky, and it's a learning experience for both the writers, the developers, and the students. But it does make a difference having all of your material in one place. That in some sense has to be coordinated, or the inconsistency must be obvious.
I think Jupyter Notebooks, thank you for that, Phil. We haven't mentioned before, a wonderful example of how the evolution of the changing environment and more powerful hardware and other resources means that certain things now become possible, and they were always better, possibly, but previously they were well out of reach. So things now are possible that couldn't be considered before. And Jupyter Notebooks are an example of that.
It is quite a serious culture change, because a lot of people would have been brought up on using Word for their writing and whatever programming language for their program stuff. And so for them, it's quite alien. I mean, me saying to my colleagues, but surely you must have memorized markup, HTML, CSS, and the odd bit of LaTeX. And they look at me as if I'm mad, which may be true, of course. I mean, but it's a culture difference. It is a culture difference.
Thank you, Phil. I think the culture is one of the words that is important in what's going on for us. I wonder if Anthony's got something to say. Yes.
Only that I wished I had discovered Jupyter Notebooks earlier, and I'm really looking forward to getting time to get my teeth onto that.
And Philip or William?
Oh, nothing to add, really. I'm just wondering what a Jupyter Notebook is.
I'll talk about Jupyter Notebooks soon. William, your chance.
I feel like documentation systems are good, can be good. but they don't really attack the fundamental problem, and that is kind of expressed in Knuth's novella, Surreal Numbers, at the end, where he talks about he likes to grade his math students 50% on their writing capability as well as the math. And in other words, others have mentioned the ability to write well, and that's the fundamental problem, I think, not the documentation system.
The problem isn't the pen. The problem is the person holding the pen. Take it however you want. So we've gone over time. Anybody that wants to stay is very welcome to stay. I'm really pleased to have had so many wonderful contributions. If I don't have your email address, pop it into the chat and I'll send you an email. It'll be nice to keep in touch. And those that want to stay can stay. Thank you very much for all your contributions. It's been really nice.